welcome Director of the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum, Dr. Kurt Graham.
Well, good evening. What a thrill to be back at the Global Forum. It's just like I pictured it would be. If America's foremost intellectual, Ralph Waldo Emerson, was correct when he said there is no history, only biography, then the story of civil rights consciousness in the United States grows out of the collective biography of Abraham Lincoln, Harry Truman, and Martin Luther King. It is a uniquely American narrative, born of humanity, of personal courage, and above all, of leadership. And I delight to be able to share it with an AJC audience, an audience that instinctively recognizes the indispensable role of these qualities in the preservation of human dignity and freedom at all times, in all places, and for all peoples. Harry Truman strode onto the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in June of 1947 to address the annual conference of the NAACP. As he stepped up to the podium, he had Abraham Lincoln over his shoulder and the 18-year-old Martin Luther King, figuratively, albeit squarely, in his sights. I should like to talk to you briefly about civil rights and human freedom, he began. It is my deep conviction that we have reached a turning point in the long history of our country's efforts to guarantee freedom and equality to all our citizens. Recent events in the United States and abroad have made us realize that it is more important today than ever before to ensure that all Americans enjoy these rights. When I say all Americans, I mean all Americans. If you are looking for the opening statement of the modern civil rights movement, it was delivered 72 years ago at a gathering not unlike this, on the steps that are behind me. But even more important than what was said was when it was said and by whom. 1947 was not exactly the golden age of equality and acceptance in American civilization. To find oneself outside of what polite and white society deemed acceptable and desirable was uncomfortable at its best and dangerous and dehumanizing at its worst. Just 16 months earlier, an African-American Army sergeant named Isaac Woodard received his honorable discharge from the service. On his way back home from the war to reunite with his family, he was dragged from a bus by South Carolina police and beaten so severely that he permanently lost his sight. At the time of the attack, Woodard was still in his uniform. When South Carolina refused to hold these officers responsible, Truman instructed the Justice Department to investigate. The investigation yielded indictments and a trial in federal court. An all-white jury, however, acquitted the officers, and the courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause as the not guilty verdict was read. In the month following that verdict, Truman established his Civil Rights Commission, but the blinding of Isaac Woodard was still very much on his mind when he spoke to the NAACP. Many of our people suffered the indignity of insult, the narrowing fear of intimidation, and, I regret to say, the threat of physical injury and mob violence. Prejudice and intolerance in which these evils are rooted still exist. The conscience of our nation and the legal machinery which enforces it have not yet secured to each citizen full freedom from fear. The context of his time might have given Truman cover, but instead, it gave him a sense of urgency. Moreover, had Truman been looking for a way to dodge a confrontation with civil rights abuses, he had more than prevalent cultural biases on which to draw. His own family context would suggest that Truman was less than likely to develop into a true champion of civil rights. The day before his address, Truman wrote to his sister back in Missouri, "I've got to make a speech to the Society for the Advancement of Colored People. Mama won't like what I say because I wind up by quoting old Abe. But I believe what I say, and I'm hopeful that we may implement it." Mama Truman would not have liked it at all. She was a Southerner's Southerner, the daughter of a slaveholding family who never lost her contempt for the damned Yankees who would have it otherwise. She asked Truman not to wear his blue Union uniform in her home when he returned from World War I. She preferred to see a man in gray. When he was president, she refused to sleep in the Lincoln bedroom when she visited him in the White House. Where her Confederate heritage was concerned, she was undeterred, unbowed, and unrepentant. For his part, Truman transcended the prevailing perspective of his family and his nation. Though he had grown up in a place and a time that nurtured prejudice, Truman rose above it. Truman overcame. Years after he left office, he reflected on the attitudes he had experienced growing up in Missouri, where, he said, a large number of people were sympathizers with the South. Until you get out in the world and you only have the ideas circulated around the place where you grew up, it was only when I was in the Army and went to Europe that I saw a fairer picture of the blacks in the U.S. As president, I did my best to change their status and help reduce discrimination. Sometimes, when I think about this subject, I regret that I didn't do more. Regret notwithstanding, Truman used his address to the NAACP and other high-profile speeches during his first term to lay the groundwork for a fairer playing field, a field leveled largely by an increased federal presence and role. We cannot any longer await the growth of a will to action in the slowest state or the most backward community. We must make the federal government a friendly, vigilant defender of the rights and equalities of all Americans. And again, I mean all Americans. We can no longer afford the luxury of a leisurely attack upon prejudice and discrimination. Truman was anything but leisurely in his pursuit of justice. He spoke directly, boldly, and specifically. Every man should have the right to a decent home, the right to an education, the right to adequate medical care, the right to a worthwhile job, the right to an equal share in the making of the public decisions through the ballot, and the right to a fair trial in a fair court. Truman was the first president to use the term civil rights. But in coining the phrase, he gave it more than a definition. Through his actions, he gave it life. It is the improbability of Truman's civil rights legacy that makes it so remarkable. Not only could he have claimed and perpetuated the bias of his regional heritage, but there were also far more pressing issues on his administration's post-war agenda. Facing housing and food shortages, labor strikes, and the associated anxieties related to transitioning the wartime economy to peacetime production, Truman was far from compelled by political and economic forces to advance the cause of an oppressed people. The political pressure we associate with the civil rights movement was not yet in place. There were no marches, no protests, no sit-ins. No one had yet dreamed the dream of justice. But Harry Truman recognized the nightmare of injustice. In the absence of political pressure, Truman acted anyway. For Truman, civil rights was not a political question, it was a moral question. When I was president, he later recalled, many people advised me not to raise the whole question of civil rights. They said it would make things worse. But you can't cure a moral problem by ignoring it. It is no service to the country to turn away from the hard problems, to ignore injustice and human suffering. It is simply not the American way of doing things. Truman's effort to confront injustice and suffering head-on drew the ire of the political establishment in the run-up to his re-election campaign. As might have been predicted in 1948, his stance on behalf of oppressed peoples fractured his administration and rent his party. And you all remember that he recognized the newborn state of Israel in May of 1948, desegregated the armed forces and the federal workforce in July of that year. Risky positions going into an election. When the racist wing of the Democratic Party broke away, it nominated South Carolina Governor Strom Thurmond as its standard bearer. When asked why he was bolting now, given that Roosevelt made similar promises on civil rights, Thurman responded, "But Truman really means it." And he did mean it. And I believe he meant it when he said he regretted that he hadn't done more. I believe it because Truman personified the imperative found in Deuteronomy, "Justice, justice you shall pursue." In a passage that might have served as a first draft of Martin Luther King's famous speech, delivered also from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, Truman stated, "As Americans, we believe that every man should be free to live his life as he wishes. He should be limited only by his responsibility to his fellow countrymen. If this freedom is to be more than a dream, each man must be guaranteed equality of opportunity. The only limit to an American's achievement should be his ability, his industry, and his character. Our immediate task is to remove the last remnants of the barriers which stand between millions of our citizens and their birthright. There is no justifiable reason for discrimination because of ancestry, of religion, or race, or color." A maxim found in the Pirkei Avot describes the life, legacy, and leadership of Harry Truman as well as anything I have ever read. In a place where there is no humanity, strive to be human. In his striving to be human, at a time when our nation was awash in a sea of inhumanity, Truman stood at the feet of the great emancipator to let the world know that the work of freedom was not yet finished, nor will it be finished until everyone is free to be human. We live in a time marked largely by the absence of leadership, but we need to remember that the March for Freedom is more than a freedom march, more than a march on Washington. It is a march toward the ultimate potential, the self-actualization and full realization of the family of man. Humanity and courage are the twin pillars of leadership. One cannot lead without genuine concern and genuine conviction. Leaders like Harry Truman absorb the anxieties of those around them. They dispel fear by instilling confidence. They inspire because they are inspiring. They place the well-being of others ahead of their own self-interest. Thus, to a leader, justice is never a burden. It is a motivator. My friends, we have seen great leadership before, and we will see it again. We will see it when we demand the humanity and courage of those who would be our leaders to echo the words and the attitude and the resolve of Harry Truman. We will be well led again when we require our representatives to reach beyond their base voters and base instincts, to connect with what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, to make Martin Luther King's dream something more than a dream. As Harry Truman concluded his remarks in 1947, he offered an observation that is as relevant for us, if not more so, than it was for his immediate audience. The way ahead is not easy. We shall need all the wisdom, imagination, and courage we can muster. We must and shall guarantee the civil rights of all our citizens. Never before has the need been so urgent for skillful and vigorous action to bring us closer to our ideal. The ideal of which Truman spoke remains intact. The self-evident truths on which our republic was founded have not changed. But the slender thread of freedom that found its way from the framers to Lincoln, from Lincoln to Truman, from Truman to King, and from King to this very hour, begs a question of each of us. As we pick up that thread, what will we weave into the next scenes of our civic tapestry? As we contemplate our shared inheritance, especially as it relates to our core principles of freedom, equality, and justice, we will do well to draw upon the example and legacy of Harry Truman in working to make the opportunity to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity fully available to all Americans. And when I say all Americans, I mean all Americans. Thank you so much, and God bless.
Thank you.